Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Most of what we're going to talk about tonight involves foreign affairs, international diplomacy. The Knesset is finishing its winter session on Thursday, and they're going to go for a 2-month break. So we can talk a little bit about what the last few days have seen, but it's certainly not as consequential, let's say, as some of the other things that are happening. We'll start with really some unprecedented events, especially which took place on Saturdays. We know it's the Jewish Sabbath, and for the first time in Israel's history, we have a religious sitting prime minister. And really, for the first time in, I don't know, maybe ever, we had a prime minister who took an emergency flight on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, on Saturday, to go and meet Russia's Vladimir Putin. It's clear that this was a last-minute decision. Perhaps it was even, well, almost certainly was a last-minute invitation. Interestingly enough, or not, he took with him the minister that usually attends meetings with Vladimir Putin, Minister of, I know he's Jerusalem and I think also construction, Zev Elkin, who's a native Russian speaker. He accompanied former Prime Minister Netanyahu during his meetings with Putin, and he's held the same job to a certain extent with Naftali Bennett. So the two of them, with some other officials, got on a plane, went to Russia, sat for over 3 hours with Vladimir Putin, the only, let's say, Western or certainly democratic leader to have sat with Vladimir Putin since the beginning of the war. He then traveled to Germany, where he met and had dinner with the German Chancellor, and then he made his way back. What is clear is that Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, has had numerous conversations, not just with Vladimir Putin, but also with Ukrainian President Zelensky and other world leaders. A lot of attention around the world has been focused on Naftali Bennett's efforts. So what exactly is happening? First of all, it is clear that Bennett is not really party to the negotiations. What he seems to be doing is relaying messages. Perhaps there's been some minor suggestions here and there, but on the whole, it seems like Bennett is not really a party to negotiations and not really necessarily a mediator in so much as he's bringing his own plans to the table, perhaps peace proposals or whatever proposals how to stop the war. He's relaying messages. He is one of the few, as I said, leaders who is trusted by both parties. So he has an important role to play. Another one is Turkey, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Israel certainly has a unique role, and that is being appreciated not just by Kiev and Moscow, but also by the Americans. Some American officials said that they are very happy and satisfied with Bennett's role, and they understand why he's doing what he's doing. But the big question is are these negotiations sincere? Are they serious? What Bennett has appeared to have transmitted the message to the West, because what seems to be is the Ukrainians, the Russians are meeting during their negotiations. A lot of what's going on is to a certain extent secretive. There is a theory that Zelensky doesn't want to tell too much about the progress because he wants to still keep that state of emergency going around the world. But the message that Bennett is bringing is that Russia would be potentially interested in stopping its advances if certain conditions were met. Obviously, the chief one is that Ukraine would not join NATO. In fact, it would declare complete neutrality. It would have to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea. It would recognize independence or autonomy over the Donbass region, and probably reduce its army and several other demands from the Russians. But it does seem that the Russians are climbing down to a certain extent from the tree of basically saying that it wanted regime change, because that seemed to be the message from the off from Vladimir Putin, that this, what he said, quote unquote, Nazi leadership had to be removed. So it does seem like that is no longer necessarily a demand. But again, the fact that an Israeli leader is taking such a central position on the world stage, and is speaking with world leaders, by the hour, is certainly not going to harm Naftali Bennett's reputation, home or abroad. One of the things that the opposition have been saying since the beginning is Bennett doesn't have the gravitas. Netanyahu was a known force on the international stage, and Bennett, no one takes him seriously. And even when the idea or the suggestion that Bennett completes some role in mediation between Russia and Ukraine, it was laughed at by the opposition. Well, it does seem like the role is being fulfilled, and it's what is also clear is that Bennett is able to discuss other issues, especially while he was in Moscow. And as I talked about last week, some of the most pressing issues for Israel is what's going on in Syria, the fact that they need to maintain the right to fly over Syria and take out senior Iranian Hezbollah terrorist leaders, and ensure that many of the weapons, high-level weapons cache that are being moved from Syria to Lebanon are not able to reach their destination. And that's crucial for Israel's security and the safety and well-being of its citizens. We'll talk a little bit about that, but a couple of days ago or yesterday, Israel took out what we now know are two senior officers in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria. And the Iranians, for the first time in quite a while, actually acknowledged their rank, and even held an official ceremony with some very high ranking Iranian Revolutionary Guards, have promised retribution, and the Israel defense and security agencies are certainly taking that seriously. So there is expected to be some attempts, maybe from Hezbollah in the north, maybe from Syria itself, maybe from Iran, maybe against Jewish or Israeli targets around the world. But the Iranians have promised some sort of retribution, because these were relatively high profile Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So that's another issue which I'm sure Naftali Bennett brought up. Obviously, another issue which seemed to have sort of stalled to a certain extent are the return to the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear negotiations in Vienna. Israel obviously has taken this opportunity to make its case to Russia. It's made its case very strongly in the past, and perhaps even more strongly in the West. And Russia and China, as we know, are more sympathetic to the Iranian cause, and have certainly been in the Iranians' corner, let's just say, far more than some of the other members of the P5+1. So there was a tremendous opportunity also for Naftali Bennett to make his case there. And it does seem that the Russian interest is at this moment to at least create some problems for the negotiations. They have raised some concerns about some of the sanctions that are being laid against Russia, and connected them to the return to the JCPOA, because obviously there are certain factors. Perhaps there's talk of some of the Iranian leaving Iran and perhaps going to Russia, and how does that fit in with sanctions? So it does seem that the Russians, whether because of Bennett, whether because of their own interest, which is probably more likely, have put a small, let's just say it's a small spanner in the works. Certainly, we're waiting to see what happens. At the moment, the Iranian negotiators have been called home to Tehran, and we don't know when the next round will be, but the West, or most of the P5+1, believe that, as does Israel, that the negotiations are coming to an end, and an agreement is pretty much going to be signed in the coming days or coming weeks. Obviously, the situation with Russia does complicate things, but there's still optimism on that. The big story of today was, for the first time in 13 years, a senior Israeli leader, President Herzog, visited Ankara in what has been dubbed a reset or a U-turn in relations with Turkey. As we know, for at least since probably 2008, some people look at 2008, when then Prime Minister Erdogan came back from visiting President Erdogan in Turkey, and then a couple of days later launched Operation Cast Lead, which the Turks claim embarrassed them, or the 2010 Mavi Marmara, the flotilla affair, or many other moments that we could talk about. The relations between Ankara and Jerusalem have been extremely difficult. And there have been other attempts at some sort of reconciliation or resets. They've all failed, but there is a feeling that this is different. The reasons are potentially numerous. First of all, the economy in Turkey is on free fall. It's they have hyperinflation, and they need to take a slightly different path. They've been trying to make new friends or remake old ties in the region. The Emirates and some of the other Sunni regions, which have been seen more as foes in recent years, and Israel is an important part of that, also because Israel itself has made important ties with some of the leading Sunni nations in the region. Turkey obviously felt that there was a need to get back on side with Israel. It also, looking to the US, there's long been this belief in Turkey that if you want to have better relations with the Americans, then you have to go through Jerusalem. Perhaps there's some truth to it or not. Certainly President Biden hasn't been over complimentary towards President Erdogan. Perhaps that's also it's a sort of a score settles when President Obama in the past tried to reach out and said that President Erdogan was one of his closest allies, and certainly wasn't reciprocated. So perhaps there's some leftover tension there. But there's an understanding that Israel is here to stay, and Israel is an important player. Another word which has been bandied around a lot is gas. As we've talked about quite a lot, that Israel is part of this sort of tri-nation Eastern Mediterranean pipeline, which at the moment isn't getting off the ground because of finance reasons. Also, the Biden administration took back its support for it, but there's still momentum on it, and there's still talks on it. And it's certainly no coincidence that President Herzog visited Cyprus and Greece before he went to Turkey, perhaps to alleviate any concerns there, because as we know, they are regional rivals, especially Greece and Turkey. So he wanted to allay any concerns that a rapprochement between Israel and Turkey won't come at the cost of relations with either of these countries. Turkey has talked about, and President Erdogan talked today during the press conference, that they would certainly like to be a partner to this pipeline. And so these are some of the reasons why President Herzog was in Ankara today. It was more ceremonial than anything else. As we know, the president of Israel is more ceremonial position. He's the head of state. But it does seem that that is where President Erdogan has felt more comfortable with this reset. And it started as soon as President Herzog was initiated into office. And what probably most was talked about today was how to reset relations and how to ensure that any diplomatic troubles that come up in the future, because there'll be many, and there potentially will be many in the future, can be resolved without these major public spats. As we know that President Erdogan sees himself as a leader in the Muslim world. So he, any time that there's any sort of flare up around Jerusalem, and especially the Temple Mount, he sees it as his responsibility to act on it. As we know, just in the last few years, he's called Israel a terrorist state. He's compared it to Hitler. All sorts of terrible and damning statements have been released. So today was quite a reset to have, the Israeli national anthem, the Israeli flag flying throughout Ankara, to have this very impressive changing of the guard and everything that went into this celebratory moment. So it's clear that Turkey do want this reset. It's not suddenly because they become lovers of Israel, but because, as I said, for other reasons. Interestingly enough, some of the terrorist organizations in our neighborhood have reacted quite negatively to it. Unsurprisingly, Hamas, who do have offices in Ankara, and that's certainly something that the Israeli interlocutors have talked about. There are reports that Hamas have been told by their Turkish hosts that they have to perhaps at least keep a low profile, but some have suggested they may even be told to move on. Hamas have opened bureaus around the region, have moved on depending on the needs and what's going on in the region. But if Turkey would tell Hamas to move on and move out of its territory, that would be a major strategic blow for the organization and a great win for Israel. So it remains to be seen. Finally, and related to many of the other things going on in the region, the chief of staff, Israel's chief of staff, Kochavi, was in Bahrain, which is also very telling, very interesting moment to talk about defense and security relations. Again, very much with what's going on in the background behind many of these events, Iran, and the fact that this was happening while the JCPOA discussions were ongoing, while Iran's many proxies were continuing their war against Sunni nations, the fact that openly, not far from Iran itself, here was the Israel chief of staff sitting in the Bahraini capital meeting with the most senior defense and security officials in the country, was certainly a message to Tehran, one that they wouldn't enjoy, but certainly one that this growing alliance between Israel and the pragmatic Sunni nations in the Gulf and beyond are telling not just Iran, but also other actors in the region beyond. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on any of these issues or anything else.
Thank you so much. The first one we have in that I feel like sums up a lot of this is Ayala Haq asked, do we really trust Erdogan?
Probably not. As I said, we're talking about only a few months ago, perhaps a year ago, I think it was during the last operation, which was in May, if I'm not much mistaken, where Israel was called a terrorist state. But the world has changed, and Turkey has changed, and the Turkish economy, more than anything else, has changed. And don't forget, during that time, we've seen the Biden administration come in, lay down its foreign policy. We've seen Israel really cement ties in the region. We've seen not just in the Gulf, but also with Greece and Cyprus and Turkey have certainly felt more isolated, and they need some assistance. They need, to help out their flailing economy. They need better relations. They need to be seen more as a positive force than a negative force, as they've been seen in recent years by many. And the comments against Israel, certainly won't be been seen well in Europe, even if they're critical of Israel's, conflict with terrorist organizations in Gaza. Certainly the language that has come out, and even the overt anti-Semitism which has come out, even by the way in the last few days from some in the inner circle of Erdogan, it's certainly given Israel pause for thought. But it's clear that today the main ceremonies, the main events, the optics of it are certainly positive. As everyone on the Israeli media said tonight, has Erdogan become a Zionist overnight? Absolutely not. So, but this is certainly, there's cause for celebration today, because there is hope that this reset will be a proper reset. There's talk about the Turkish foreign minister coming in the next few weeks. There's talk about a return of ambassadors, the Israeli one to Ankara and the Turkish one to Tel Aviv. So there's certainly cause for a lot of optimism, but Israel will certainly understand that it's not because he's suddenly become a lover of Israel or Zionism. So they'll take everything with a pinch of salt, but there's great optimism that comes along with that.
Thank you. Sandra Bellestrino asked, what do you make of Russian comments regarding non-recognition of the Golan and directing these comments to Tel Aviv instead of Jerusalem?
Well, the second part is nothing new. Only a few countries in the world recognized Jerusalem as the capital. So most nations in the world, when they refer to Israel's capital, they refer to Tel Aviv, which is obviously bizarre. It's one thing if you don't want to recognize Jerusalem, but to decide our capital is somewhere else. Any leader who comes to Israel, if they want to go to the president's office, the prime minister's office, the Knesset, or the other ministries, they come to Jerusalem. There's not to say there's nothing in Tel Aviv, but certainly not our capital. But Israel is used to that. But as I said, I think last week, that message was sent at a very crucial time in the war for Russia, and they wanted to send a message that we're watching how you respond, Israel. As I said, because Israel has a relatively unique place to play, and the fact that they don't recognize the Golan. Again, the vast majority of the world do not recognize Israel's sovereignty on the Golan, especially as they are being hosted in Syria, or rather, it depends who really is the host, but they are next door in Syria, and they have very close relations with Assad, so they're not going to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan. So there's nothing particularly new. I think it got a lot of attention because of the wording at a time where Russia was invading a sovereign country itself. So I think there was the seeming hypocrisy of the statement was what made it unique, but the sentiment itself is certainly not unique.
Understood. Thank you. Eric asks, with the West desperate for oil, do you fear that could push the West to make a bad Iran deal? Can Israel help the West with their natural gas holdings or help increase Saudi output?
Well, there's a worry, regardless of what happened in Russia, in Ukraine, that a bad deal was coming. I mean, Israel does believe it's a bad deal. It's certainly not longer and stronger. So it's not really dependent on it. In fact, if anything, the conflict could actually, as I said, put a minor spanner in the works, could perhaps make some, Russians could make some problems with it now, because it is a place where they're sitting down with the West, while the West is sanctioning Russia and taking all sorts of measures against it. In Vienna, the parties are sitting down together. So the Russians are not one to miss an opportunity for these sort of things. So it wouldn't surprise me if they seek to gain something out of these negotiations. So if anything, it could make the signing of a deal, it could push it back a little bit, but we'll have to see. As far as the energy issue, listen, the energy issue is an issue. From what I understand, Europe receives at least 10% of its energy from Russia, and where do you get a lot of the other energy is in the Middle East. A lot of it goes through the Straits, where Iran has a lot of control. So certainly it could destabilize. Interestingly enough, there was reports today that the Saudis and the Emirati leaders have not been taking President Biden's calls for a few weeks. There is an idea that to try and offset what the West get from Russia, to try and sort of get it from the Middle East. As we know, President Biden, when he came into office, certainly didn't continue the close relationship that the Americans had with some of the Gulf states. So now to suddenly turn around and say, well, we need you now, certainly this has emboldened some in the region, and they want to know what they're going to get, because at the moment, before this, they felt very much frozen out from the US, and now it appears that the US need them. So these are all elements that the Iranians will be watching, the Saudis will be watching, other Gulf states will be watching, because all of these events appear to be really tied in at the moment.
Thank you. Lois asks, how many Ukrainian refugees have arrived in Israel for asylum or residence? What documents are waived or required under these emergency conditions?
It's not clear, or at least if it is clear, it's not clear to me and to many. Anyone who can make aliyah, can immigrate to Israel under the law of return, can do so anyway. They have to prove documentation. There was a report tonight that Israel expects as much as 50,000 new immigrants from. It's not clear if it's only from Ukraine. Maybe there'll be other Baltic states that will also feel that maybe Israel's a safer bet. Perhaps also some Russian Jews will make Aliyah, perhaps also related to what's going on. But the fact that 50,000 would be coming when only around 20,000 or maybe a little bit more make Aliyah every year would certainly be a massive amount. And people are talking about the economic cost of such a massive increase in Aliyah, and whether it would play into a lot of other, the cost of living, and they're trying to lower the cost of property at the moment, which is just not working. So it certainly cost Israel a lot of money. From what I understand, Israel has set a number, I think it's 20 to 25,000 people that's willing to accept who are not able to make Aliyah. In other words, they are not Jewish or have one Jewish grandparent, which from what I understand is the highest per capita refugee cap that's pretty much anywhere in the world outside of those neighboring countries to Ukraine itself. So Israel is prepared to do quite a lot, it seems, to help refugees that can make it to Israel.
Thank you. Michael Ginsberg asks, what is your opinion of Robert Malley, the U.S. chief negotiator for the present Iran deal? Didn't he also negotiate the 2015 JCPOA? I hear he's not a fan of Israel's statement.
I'm not going to get too personal about any particular individual, but it's all I can say is in Israel, there was a cause for concern when in January, one of the senior negotiators, actually one senior negotiator and two lower down negotiators suddenly resigned. These particular negotiators represented a more hawkish approach to the negotiations, and the fact that they resigned certainly gave Malley more power. He is seen as a more dovish wing within negotiators, and the fact that his opposition within the negotiating team appeared to, basically break away. Then they weren't happy about what's happening and how far the US and the West in general were going, certainly gave Israel a lot of cause for concern. And there's been endless commentary about exactly what that means. But the fact that we are here today, where it seems that we're on the verge of a return to the JCPOA, is certainly something which bothers Israel. Some commentators have certainly pointed fingers at Malley as someone who was involved in the original JCPOA, which Israel did not like in the first place, but certainly return to the JCPOA under what Israel would see as very weak conditions is certainly something that Israel is very concerned about and has made it clear to the US and others.
So an anonymous attendee asked, will Putin try to recruit experienced Syrian or Hezbollah fighters to fight alongside Chechen special forces in the Ukraine? The existing forces, raw Russian conscripts, have taken very heavy casualties, estimated as high as 10,000.
Well, it's not something I'm obviously privy to, but I have seen these reports. It would make sense, though the Syrian army is certainly not the most professional army in the world. The fact that, without foreign assistance, whether Russian or Iranian, Syria would have fallen a long time ago. So I'm not sure what he'd get out of that, perhaps more manpower, but it does seem that that there is an interest in looking for more recruits, because the Russians are taking more casualties than they originally thought. And there's even talk of as much as 10% of the army has already been degraded during this war.
And a follow-up from Haya Gill. Should Israel expect obstacles by Russia in Syria when it tries to hit Iran there?
Well, the fact that even in the last couple of days, Israel has flown various sorties over Syria, the Russians again are keeping to basically keeping to what's happened before, that Israel will be able to, as long as it doesn't target obviously Russians or Russian assets, it maintains the right to fly over. It has to let the Russians know, and there's obviously a worry that either could get in each could get in the other's way, but Israel still apparently maintains the ability to fly in and take out Iranian Hezbollah assets. As I said last week, this isn't just in Israel's interest, this is also in Russia, because Russia wants to weaken the Iranian presence in Syria.
All right. Well, with 10 seconds left, I guess we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with David Cook discussing Islamic studies today, challenges and trends. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.